Honey, can you make sure the steak is medium rare tonight? My boss is coming over and I can't have you embarrassing me with another dry piece of meat like last time. Those were the first words out of my husband's mouth when he walked through the door. No, hello. No, how was your day? Just a demand. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was too busy adjusting his silk tie in the hallway mirror, admiring the man he thought he had become. To the world, my husband David was a self-made titan of industry. To him, I was just the woman who kept his shirts pressed and his floors polished. I was the penniless housewife, the one who had hit the lottery by marrying a man like him. He liked to tell our friends that he rescued me from a life of waitressing and struggle. He liked to remind me every single day that without his paycheck, I'd be nothing. "Did you hear me?" he snapped, finally turning his gaze toward me. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth that had been there 10 years ago. "And for heaven's sake, wear that blue dress, the one that makes you look, well, at least presentable. Try to look like you belong in this house." I felt a familiar sting in my chest, but I didn't let it reach my face. I just nodded, my hands tucked into my apron pockets. "I heard you, David," I said softly. "Medium rare, blue dress. I'll make sure everything is perfect." He smirked, a patronizing little twist of his lips, and headed upstairs to take a shower. He thought he was the king of this castle. He thought he held all the power because he held the bank accounts. What he didn't know was that I had been keeping a secret. A secret that lived in a small, battered laptop hidden beneath the floorboards of our guest room closet. I should have walked away a long time ago, when the comments about my weight started, when he began staying out late, smelling like expensive perfume that wasn't mine, when he stopped looking at me as a partner and started treating me like a piece of furniture he'd grown tired of. But I didn't walk away. I stayed, and I stayed quiet. Because I knew that if I left then, I'd leave with nothing. He had prenuptial agreements drawn up by the best lawyers money could buy. He had hidden assets. He had a way of making people disappear from his life without leaving a trace of his fortune behind. So, I played the part. I played the doting, a slightly dim-witted wife who didn't understand big business talk. I let him talk down to me at dinner parties. I let him laugh when I asked questions about his company, Apex Logistics. "Oh, darling," he'd say, patting my hand while the other men at the table chuckled. "Don't worry your pretty little head about overheads and acquisitions. Just focus on picking out the right curtains for the summer house." I'd smile and sip my wine, and they'd all think I was the luckiest woman alive. But that afternoon, as I prepped the steak, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a private notification, a single line of text from a contact labeled simply as C. "The final shares have cleared. You now hold 51%. You are the majority owner. Tell me when you want to pull the trigger." My heart hammered against my ribs. It was happening. Faster than I thought. For 3 years, I had been funneling every cent of the allowance David gave me into a series of shell companies. I had used the inheritance from my grandmother, the one David thought I'd spent on designer handbags, to day trade and invest in the very tech startups he was trying to crush. I had been his silent competitor. I had been the anonymous buyer who had been slowly, methodically snapping up the debt his company was drowning in. That's when everything changed. The power wasn't just shifting, it had already shifted. He just didn't know it yet. Tonight wasn't just a dinner for his boss. His boss was a man named Mr. Anderson, a man David was desperate to impress because he needed a massive cash infusion to save Apex from bankruptcy. David thought he was hosting a savior. But what he didn't realize was that I had bought Mr. Anderson's firm last Tuesday. I looked at the steak on the counter. It was high-quality Wagyu, expensive, just like everything in this house, just like the life David thought he owned. "Medium rare," I whispered to the empty kitchen. "I'll give you exactly what you asked for, David. One last time." I went upstairs to change into the blue dress. As I zipped it up, I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a penniless housewife. I saw a woman who had been underestimated for a decade, and I saw a woman who was about to take back every ounce of dignity that had been stolen from her. The doorbell rang. But before I tell you what happened when I opened that door, I want to know, have you ever been in a situation where someone looked down on you because of your job or your status? How did it make you feel? I really want to hear your stories in the comments below. Also, if you're enjoying this journey of reclamation, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps me tell more stories like this one. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? The doorbell's chime echoed through the house, sounding like a starter pistol. I took one last breath, smoothing the silk of the blue dress David insisted I wear. It was a beautiful dress, but to him, it was just a uniform for his favorite servant. "I'll get it," David shouted from the top of the stairs, his voice booming with a false sense of authority. He practically sprinted down the hallway, brushing past me without a second glance. He didn't notice the way I stood a little taller, or the way my eyes didn't drop to the floor when he neared. He was too focused on the door, on the man he thought held his entire future in his hands. David swung the door open, his face instantly transforming into a mask of practiced, sycophantic warmth. "Mr. Anderson, welcome, welcome. It's an absolute honor to have you in our home," David gushed, extending a hand. Mr. Anderson was a tall, silver-haired man with eyes like flint. He was known in the industry as the Liquidator. He didn't smile. He just stepped inside and handed his coat to David as if David were the butler. "Thank you, David," Anderson said, his voice a low rumble. Then his eyes shifted to me. He paused, a flicker of something passing over his face. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. "Oh, and you must be the wife," Anderson said. "This is my wife," David said, his tone shifting to that dismissive, patronizing lilt he used for the help. "She handles the domestic side of things. Doesn't know much about the world of logistics, but she makes a mean martini. Don't you, dear?" He laughed, and I saw Anderson's eyebrows twitch. "I try my best," I said, my voice steady and calm. I walked over and offered my hand to Anderson. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person, Mr. Anderson. I've followed your career with great interest." David let out a sharp, bark-like laugh. "Listen to her. Followed your career. She probably saw your name in a lifestyle magazine while getting her nails done. Go on, honey, check on that steak. We have big things to discuss." I felt the heat rise in my neck, but it wasn't shame. It was fuel. I turned toward the kitchen, but as I walked away, I heard Anderson ask, "Is she always this quiet, David?" "Quiet is a virtue in a wife, isn't it?" David replied, his voice fading as they moved toward the lounge. "Keep them fed and keep them comfortable, and they don't ask questions about where the money comes from." What they didn't know was that I wasn't just quiet. I was a sponge. For the last 2 hours of the evening, I played the part of the invisible hostess. I served the appetizers. I poured the vintage Bordeaux that David had bought specifically to impress a man he couldn't afford to lose. I made sure the steak was exactly medium rare, just as David had demanded. But as I moved back and forth from the dining room, I kept my ears open. "The numbers aren't looking good, David," Anderson said, his voice cutting through the clinking of silverware. "Apex is bleeding. Your overhead is astronomical, and your competitors are eating your lunch. You're asking for a $10 million lifeline, but frankly, I don't see the ROI. David's voice took on a desperate edge. "It's a temporary slump, I swear. We have the infrastructure. We just need the liquidity to pivot toward the new tech-based shipping models. If you back us, we can crush the smaller players by the end of the quarter." "Smaller players?" Anderson asked. "You mean like the group that's been buying up your debt?" David froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What group? I told you that's just a standard market correction. No one is buying our debt." "David," Anderson said, sounding almost bored, "someone has been systematically purchasing your outstanding loans for 18 months. They now hold nearly 40% of your liability. If they call those notes, you don't just lose the company. You lose this house. You lose everything." I stood in the shadows of the kitchen doorway, holding a tray of dessert plates. I watched David's face go pale. He looked small. For the first time in our marriage, he looked like a man who realized he wasn't the smartest person in the room. I didn't know, David stammered. Who are they? Some hedge fund? They operate under an LLC called Phoenix Rising, Anderson said. I've tried to track the principal, but the trail is buried under layers of offshore accounts and shell companies. Whoever they are, they're brilliant, and they're patient. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. Well, it would have scared them if they knew I was the one they were talking about. I walked into the room then, setting the dessert plates down with a soft clack. Everything all right, David? I asked, my voice dripping with faux concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. Not now, David snapped, his temper flaring because of his fear. Go to the kitchen. We're discussing business. Actually, Mr. Anderson said, standing up, I think I've heard enough. David, your company is a sinking ship and you don't even know who's drilling the holes. I can't help you. My firm was recently acquired by a larger conglomerate, and my new board has issued a strict no-rescue policy for failing logistics firms. David stood up so fast he knocked his chair over. Acquired? By who? You're the biggest player in the city. Anderson looked at me, then back at David. A strange smile played on his lips. That's the funny thing, David. I'm not allowed to say, but the new owner, they're local, and they've been watching you very, very closely. Anderson turned to me and bowed his head slightly. The meal was excellent. Thank you for your hospitality. As David scrambled to follow Anderson to the door, begging for 5 more minutes, for one more chance, I sat down in David's chair at the head of the table. I took a piece of the expensive steak I had cooked and popped it into my mouth. It was perfectly seasoned. David returned a moment later, slamming the front door so hard the crystal chandelier rattled. He marched into the dining room, his face purple with rage. You! He yelled, pointing a finger at me. You and your stupid questions. You probably jinxed the whole thing with your presence. Why couldn't you just stay in the kitchen? I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just wiped my mouth with the silk napkin and looked him dead in the eye. David, I said, my voice cold and clear. Mr. Anderson is right. You are a sinking ship. And I think it's time you realized exactly who's been holding the drill. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. What are you talking about? You don't know anything about business. You can't even balance a checkbook without my help. Is that so? I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket, the one I'd printed out an hour before dinner. I slid it across the table. Then you might want to explain why your name isn't on the title of this house anymore. David's laugh died in his throat. He snatched the paper, his eyes darting over the legal jargon. This is a lien, he whispered. A lien from Phoenix Rising? How did you get this? I didn't get it, David, I said, standing up and leaning over the table until our faces were inches apart. I signed it. The look of confusion on his face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. But I wasn't done. Not even close. He thought he knew who I was. David stared at the document, his hands beginning to shake. It was a subtle tremor at first, the kind you only notice if you've spent a decade monitoring a man's every mood to avoid an explosion. I watched that tremor spread from his fingers to his shoulders. You signed this? He whispered, his voice cracking. That's impossible. This is a legal notice from a multi-million-dollar investment firm. You're just a housewife. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat back down, crossing my legs. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that comes when you finally stop hiding in the shadows and step into the light. That's the word you love so much, isn't it? Just, I said, my voice as smooth as the wine he'd poured for Anderson. Just a wife, just a cook, just a pretty face to sit at the end of the table. You used that word like a cage, David, but you forgot one thing about cages. If you don't lock the door, the bird doesn't just sit there. It watches. It learns. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and disbelief. What did you do? Did you steal money from our joint account? Is that what this is? I'll have you in jail by morning. I couldn't help it. I laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh, but a genuine one. Our joint account? You mean the one you keep exactly $5,000 in at any given time to make sure I have to ask permission for a new pair of shoes? No, David. I didn't touch your money. I didn't have to. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to that intimate late-night whisper that used to signify affection, but now felt like a sharpened blade. Do you remember 3 years ago, when you were so stressed about the expansion into the Eastern Corridor? You were drinking a bottle of scotch a night, leaving your laptop open on the study desk. You thought I was asleep. You thought I was upstairs dreaming of curtains and recipes. David's face went from pale to a ghostly white. I wasn't sleeping, I continued. I was sitting in the dark at the top of the stairs watching you, and when you finally passed out on the sofa, I didn't tuck you in. I went into that study. I saw the spreadsheets. I saw how you were over-leveraging the company. I saw the creative accounting you were using to hide the losses from your board. That's illegal, he hissed, though we both knew he was talking about my spying, not his fraud. What they didn't know was that I understood every single line on those pages, I said. My father didn't just leave me a small inheritance, David. He left me a legacy of financial literacy. He taught me how to read the bones of a company before you ever met me. I just let you believe I was a blank slate because it made you feel powerful, and a powerful man is a careless man. I watched him try to process the fact that the woman he'd belittled for a decade was the same person who had been tracking his every financial misstep. I took my grandmother's inheritance, I said, and I didn't buy bags. I bought tech shorts. I bet against the very companies you were trying to partner with. And when I won, I moved the money. Again and again. I created Phoenix Rising not just to make money, but to catch you when you inevitably fell. David stood up, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor. This is a joke. It has to be. You can't own the debt. You don't have the standing. I'll call my lawyers. Go ahead, I said, gesturing to his phone on the table. Call them. Ask them about the anonymous entity that bought out the primary creditor for your warehouse leases last month. Ask them who owns the trademark to the logistics software your entire fleet runs on. His hand reached for the phone, then hesitated. The realization was finally sinking in. The invisible woman had become a giant, and he was standing in my shadow. Why? He choked out. I gave you everything, this house, the cars, the life. Why would you do this to me? I stood up, the calm finally breaking into a cold, hard anger. You didn't give me a life, David. You gave me a script. You expected me to play the supporting role in the story of David until I withered away. You humiliated me in front of our friends. You told me I was lucky you picked me up out of the dirt. Well, guess what? The dirt is where things grow, and I've been growing for a long time. I walked toward the hallway, pausing at the door. Oh, and David, the medium-rare steak? It was a bit overcooked, just like your career. I walked upstairs, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his ego. But as I reached the landing, I heard him shouting into the phone, his voice desperate. He wasn't calling a lawyer. He was calling someone named Brittany. My heart didn't break. It just turned to stone. I knew Brittany. She was his VP of marketing, and I knew exactly what he was going to ask her to do. He was going to try to hide the remaining assets before I could touch them. He thought he still had a move left on the board. What he didn't realize was that I had already hacked Brittany's work email 6 months ago. I sat in the darkness of the guest room, the blue dress feeling like a suit of armor I was finally ready to shed. Downstairs, I could hear David's voice rising and falling in frantic waves. He was pacing. I could picture him, red-faced, sweating through his expensive shirt, his hand running through his hair until it stood up in jagged clumps. The invincible CEO was crumbling. I opened my laptop. The screen's glow was the only light in the room, casting long, sharp shadows against the floral wallpaper David had picked out because he said it looked homely. I hated that wallpaper. It felt like being trapped inside a grandma's tea cozy. I logged into the server. My fingers flew across the keys with a muscle memory David would never have recognized. While he was at his golf club, I was taking advanced coding courses. While he was at late-night meetings with Brittany, I was learning the architecture of his company's back end. I saw the connection pop up immediately. David was on a secure line, or so he thought, with Brittany. "You have to move it now!" David hissed into his phone. I could hear him through the thin floorboards and see his panicked messages appearing on my screen as he typed to her simultaneously. "Transfer the offshore reserves to the holding account in the Cayman Islands. If my wife has really been buying up the debt, she'll go after the liquid assets next." I watched Brittany's reply blink onto my screen. "David, that's highly irregular. If the auditors see a sudden shift of $8 million tonight, we're both finished. I could lose my license." "I don't care about your license," David typed back, his desperation bleeding through the screen. "I'm the one who put you in that position. Do it, or I'll tell the board whose idea the misallocated marketing budget really was." I leaned back, a cold smile touching my lips. There it was, the betrayal within the betrayal. He wasn't just losing his company. He was threatening his mistress to save his skin. He was showing his true colors, and they were uglier than I had imagined. "And then I realized the truth," I whispered to the empty room. "David never loved anyone. Not me, not Brittany, not even the company. He only loved the image of himself as a winner, and a man who only loves himself is a man who can be easily manipulated, because he assumes everyone else is as shallow as he is." I didn't stop the transfer. In fact, I helped it. I wrote a small script, a digital bridge, and inserted it into the transfer protocol Brittany was nervously setting up. David thought he was moving those $8 million to a safe haven. What he didn't know was that I had spent the last month setting up a mirror account. To the bank, it would look like the money went where David directed, but in reality, it was being diverted into a trust fund for the very employees David was planning to lay off next week to cut costs. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. Actually, I stayed silent because I wanted them to feel the false hope. I wanted David to feel that rush of relief when he saw the transfer complete notification. I wanted him to sleep for one more hour believing he had outsmarted me. Because the fall is always harder when you think you've just climbed back to the top. A few minutes later, the house went quiet. I heard David's heavy footsteps on the stairs. He didn't come to the guest room. He went to his master bedroom and slammed the door. He didn't check on me. He didn't apologize for the things he'd said at dinner. He probably thought he had won. He probably thought I was in here crying into my pillow, wondering how I'd survive without his allowance. I shut the laptop and tucked it back into its hiding place. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there was the office of Apex Logistics, a cold glass and steel monument to David's ego. By tomorrow morning, that monument would belong to me. But I wasn't just going to take his office. I was going to take his reputation. I should have walked away the night I found the first receipt for a jewelry store I'd never been to. I should have walked away when he told me my opinion on politics was cute but uninformed. But if I had walked away then, I would have been the ex-wife, the woman who got a settlement and moved to a smaller house and was whispered about at brunch. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be the ex-wife. I would be the boss. I went to the closet and pulled out a suitcase I had hidden behind my winter coats. It wasn't full of clothes. It was full of evidence. Every forged signature, every diverted fund, every email David had ever sent belittling his staff or skirting the law. This is where they made their biggest mistake. They thought I was a spectator in my own life. I laid down on the guest bed, but I didn't sleep. I just watched the clock. 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m. At 6 a.m., David's alarm went off. I heard him moving around, his confidence restored by the morning light and the $8 million he thought he had successfully stolen. I heard him whistling in the shower. He actually had the audacity to whistle. I got up, washed my face, and put on a charcoal gray suit I'd bought in secret months ago. No more blue dresses, no more presentable housewife. I went downstairs and started the coffee. When David walked into the kitchen, he was wearing his power suit. He looked at me, and for a second, a flicker of yesterday's fear crossed his face. But then he remembered his offshore safety net and smirked. "Morning, honey," he said, reaching for a mug. About last night. Let's just say things got a bit heated. I'm willing to overlook your little hobby with that investment firm if you stop this nonsense. I'll even increase your monthly budget. What do you say? I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. The budget is fine, David, I said, but you're late. Late for what? He asked, checking his gold watch. My first meeting isn't until 9. No, I said, pointing to the driveway as a black SUV pulled up. You're late for the handover. The confusion returned to his eyes, but this time it was followed by a knock at the door that sounded like a gavel. David stood frozen, his coffee mug hovering halfway to his lips. He looked at the black SUV idling in our driveway, then back at me. The smugness that had carried him down the stairs was evaporating, replaced by a twitch at the corner of his eye. Who is that? He demanded, his voice dropping an octave as he tried to regain his footing. If you've called the police over some domestic dispute, I swear to God you'll regret it. You have no proof of anything. I didn't answer him. Instead, I walked to the front door and opened it. 2 men and a woman in charcoal suits stood on the porch. They didn't look like police. They looked like what they were, high-level forensic accountants and a process server. Good morning, I said, stepping aside. He's in the kitchen. David marched into the hallway, his face turning a deep, angry crimson. What is the meaning of this? Get out of my house. I don't care who you are, you're trespassing. The woman, a sharp-eyed professional named Nicole, whom I'd been working with for months, stepped forward. She didn't look intimidated. She'd spent her career looking at men like David, men who thought they were giants until someone checked their foundations. Mr. David, she said, her voice clinical, I am here representing the majority shareholder of Apex Logistics. We are serving you with an immediate suspension of your duties as CEO, pending a full internal audit. You are also being served with a temporary restraining order regarding the company's liquid assets. David let out a bark of a laugh, though it sounded more like a choke. Majority shareholder? I own 49% of the company. The rest is held by institutional investors who would never... The institutional investors sold their blocks weeks ago, David, I interrupted, leaning against the doorframe, to Phoenix Rising, and since Phoenix Rising also holds the debt you defaulted on as of midnight. Well, the math is pretty simple, even for a penniless housewife. David's hand went to his pocket, likely reaching for his phone to check that $8 million transfer from last night. Don't bother, I said, my voice quiet and steady. The transfer you and Brittany attempted at 2 a.m.? It was flagged by the system I installed on the server 3 months ago. The funds have been diverted to an escrow account under the supervision of the board. Your safety net just turned into a noose. The blood drained from his face so fast I thought he might actually faint. He looked at the process server, then at me, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal. You set me up, he whispered. No, David, I replied. You set yourself up. I just sat back and watched you do it. I stayed quiet, and that scared you more than any shouting match ever could, because while you were talking, I was listening. While you were posturing, I was planning. This won't hold up, David roared, his desperation finally boiling over into raw, ugly rage. He lunged toward me, but the 2 men with Nicole moved with surprising speed, ice stepping between us. Mr. David, one of them said firmly, I suggest you keep your distance. Everything in this house, including the house itself, is currently tied up in the litigation regarding the embezzlement of company funds. We are here to escort you to the office to collect your personal belongings. Only personal belongings. David looked around the foyer, the marble floors, the expensive art, the life he had built on a foundation of lies and my forced silence. He looked like he was seeing it for the first time as something he didn't own. He turned to me, his lip curling. You think you're so smart? You think you can run a company like Apex? You'll be bankrupt in 6 months. You don't have the stomach for what I do. You're right, David, I said, stepping closer to him, ignoring the security guards. I don't have the stomach for fraud or for belittling the people who work for me or for cheating on the person I swore to protect. That's why the company is going to do better under my leadership. Because I actually know the value of things, and I know the value of people. I reached out and adjusted his tie, mimicking the way he used to do it in front of the mirror. Now go. You're late for your exit interview. As they led him out the door, David looked back over his shoulder. For a split second, I saw it. Not anger, but a profound, hollow fear. The fear of a man who realized that the nothing he had been living with was actually the only thing that had been holding his world together. I walked back into the kitchen and poured the rest of the coffee down the sink. I didn't want anything in this house that tasted like him anymore. I had a board meeting at 10 o'clock, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't going as a guest. I was going as the owner. The lobby of Apex Logistics was a cathedral of glass and steel, designed to make everyone who entered feel small. For years, I had walked through these doors 2 paces behind David, carrying his dry cleaning or a forgotten briefcase, a ghost in a blue dress. Today, the automatic doors hissed open, and I walked in alone. The receptionist, a young woman named Megan, whom David had frequently reduced to tears over minor scheduling errors, looked up from her desk. She began her rehearsed robotic greeting. "Good morning. Welcome to Apex." "Oh, Mrs. David. Is David, Mr. David, is he with you?" "No, Megan," I said, stopping at her desk. I didn't look down at her. I looked at her. "He won't be coming in today, or any day." Her eyes went wide, flicking to the 2 security guards who had followed me in, the ones I'd hired from a private firm, not the ones David had on the payroll. "I need you to call a company-wide meeting in the main atrium for 10:15, I said calmly. "And Megan, take a breath. You're doing a great job." I didn't wait for her to respond. I headed straight for the executive elevator. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a rhythmic reminder that I was finally taking up the space I had been forced to shrink out of. When the doors opened on the top floor, the atmosphere was thick with tension. News travels fast in a sinking ship, and the sight of David being escorted from his home earlier that morning had clearly reached the office. Brittany, the VP of marketing, was standing outside David's office door, making her face a mask of frantic composure. When she saw me, her expression shifted from confusion to a sneer. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, stepping forward to block my path. "This isn't a country club fundraiser. We're in the middle of a crisis, and the last thing we need is a housewife wandering around the executive suite." I stopped inches from her. She was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car, paid for, no doubt, with the marketing budget David had diverted for her. "The crisis is over, Brittany," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "The cleanup, however, is just beginning." "I've already called the board," she snapped, crossing her arms. "David explained everything. You've had some kind of breakdown and tried to steal company passwords. We're having you removed." "That's funny," I said, pulling a tablet from my bag. "Because I'm the one who called the board. And since I now hold the majority of the voting shares through Phoenix Rising, I've already moved to terminate your contract for cause. Specifically, for the unauthorized attempted transfer of $8 million to a Cayman account last night." Brittany's face went a sickly shade of gray. Her arms dropped to her sides. I was following orders. David said, "David is no longer in a position to give orders, and neither are you." I stepped around her, my shoulder brushing hers. "Pack your things. You have 10 minutes before security escorts you out. And Brittany, don't bother taking the company laptop. I've already wiped your access." I walked into David's office, the throne room. It smelled of expensive cigars and the heavy, stifling scent of his cologne. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city. For 10 years, I had been the silent partner in a marriage that felt like a hostile takeover. I had been told I was nothing so many times that I almost started to believe it. "They thought I was nothing," I whispered to the glass. What they didn't know was that I was the one building the storm. That's when the truth hit me with full force. My revenge wasn't just about the money or the company. It was about the fact that David's biggest mistake wasn't financial. It was the psychological error of assuming that silence equals absence. He thought because I wasn't screaming, I wasn't feeling. He thought because I wasn't competing, I wasn't winning. The clock struck 10:15. I turned and walked out of the office, heading toward the atrium. As I stood on the mezzanine overlooking the hundreds of employees gathered below, a hush fell over the room. They looked up at me, the woman they'd seen in the background of company photos for years. I stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Amanda," I said, my voice echoing through the glass hall. It felt strange to say my own name in this building. To most of them, I was just the wife. Most of you know me as David's spouse, but today I stand before you as the new chairwoman of the board and the majority owner of this company. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw some people whispering, some frowning, and others, the ones David had treated the worst, looking up with a glimmer of hope. The previous management led this company to the brink of ruin through greed and deceit, I continued. But that ends today. There will be no layoffs. The $8 million that was nearly stolen last night has been recovered and will be used to stabilize our operations and honor your bonuses. The room erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was the sound of 1,000 people suddenly being able to breathe again. But as I looked out at the cheering crowd, I saw a familiar figure standing at the back of the room, flanked by 2 police officers. It was David. He had come back, likely to try one last desperate play. He was shouting something, his face distorted with rage, but no one could hear him over the sound of the people he had spent years looking down on. He was finally the invisible one. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. But now, it was time to speak. As I stood on that mezzanine, watching the police lead David away, I realized that I had spent years imagining this moment. In my head, I thought I'd feel a rush of adrenaline, a triumphant cinematic high. But the reality was much quieter. It was heavy. I walked back to the CEO's office, the room that had always felt like a sanctuary for David's ego. Now it just felt like a room that needed a lot of cleaning. I sat behind the mahogany desk. It was too big for me. David had chosen it specifically because it was imposing. I looked at the family photo on the corner, the one where I was smiling and he was looking at the camera like he'd just won a trophy. I turned it face down. A soft knock came at the door. It was Mr. Anderson. He had a strange look on his face, a mixture of respect and deep, wary caution. "You've caused quite a stir, Amanda," he said, sitting in the chair across from me without being asked. "Well, the market is already reacting. People are calling Phoenix Rising the new predator of the logistics world. They want to know who the genius behind the curtain is." "The curtain is gone, Mr. Anderson," I said. "And I'm not a predator. I'm just someone who paid attention when everyone else was looking away." "What they didn't know was," Anderson started, echoing my own thoughts, "was that you weren't just watching David. You were watching me, too. You knew my firm was being acquired before I did." "Information is the only real currency in this town," I replied, "and David was spending his on vanity. I spent mine on leverage." Anderson nodded slowly. "So what now? You have the company. You have the assets. You've successfully humiliated the man who spent a decade making you feel like a ghost. Is it enough?" I looked out the window at the city below. I could see the tiny figures of people on the sidewalk, each living their own invisible lives. "It's not about enough, Mr. Anderson. It's about balance. David thought he could build a life by tearing mine down. He thought my silence was permission. I didn't just want his money. I wanted him to understand that the person he dismissed as nothing was the only reason he was something." But as Anderson left, the quiet of the office began to press in on me. The slow burn of my revenge was finally cooling, and in its place was a strange, hollow reflection. I had spent 3 years focused on this single goal. Every waking hour was dedicated to his downfall. I had become a master of shadows, a whisperer of numbers, a ghost in the machine. But as I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of David's computer, I wondered if I had lost the girl I used to be. The one who liked to laugh, the one who believed in partnerships that didn't involve hostile takeovers. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I stayed until I became the very thing I was fighting, a person who lived for power. That's when I realized the final truth of my revenge. To truly win, I couldn't just take his chair. I had to be a different kind of leader than he ever was. I had to prove that I didn't need to be a monster to succeed. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My sister. The one David told me was a bad influence because she encouraged me to go back to school. "Hey," I said, my voice cracking for the first time in months. "It's me. I'm coming over. I have a lot to tell you." But before I could leave, my desk phone buzzed. It was Megan. Amanda," she said, her voice shaking. "There's a woman here. Her name is Brittany. She says she won't leave until she speaks with you. She says she has something you need to see. Something about David's private files that weren't on the server." My heart skipped a beat. A secret advantage? Or a final trap? I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. But this time it was me who was starting to feel the chill. "Send her in," I said. The door opened and Brittany walked in. The confident, sharp-edged woman from that morning was gone. She looked small, her makeup smudged, clutching a thick manila envelope to her chest like a shield. She didn't sit down. She just laid the envelope on the desk. I'm not here to ask for my job back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know I'm done, but David, he's not who you think he is, and I'm not just talking about the money." I opened the envelope. Inside were photographs and private investigator reports. My breath caught in my throat. I expected more mistresses. I expected more hidden bank accounts. What I didn't expect was that David had been planning to declare me mentally unfit for years. There were forged medical reports, drafts of commitment papers, and even correspondence with a corrupt doctor. David hadn't just wanted to keep me as a housewife. He was building a case to have me legally silenced and institutionalized so he could take full control of my grandmother's inheritance without my signature. "He was going to do it next month," Brittany said, a tear finally escaping. "That's why he was so desperate for the cash infusion from Anderson. He needed to pay off the people helping him set you up." I sat back, the room spinning. I thought I had been the one playing the long game, but David had been playing a much darker one. I had been fighting for my dignity. He had been fighting to erase my very existence. What they didn't know was, I started, my voice barely audible, was that I was faster. I looked at Brittany. She was a co-conspirator, yes, but she was also a victim of a man who used people like currency. "Go home, Brittany," I said, sliding the envelope back toward her. "Take these. Give them to the police. If you testify against him regarding the medical fraud, I'll instruct my lawyers to go easy on your involvement with the embezzlement." She nodded, grabbed the papers, and fled. I stood up and walked to the window one last time. This is where he made his biggest mistake. He underestimated the invisible woman's will to survive. He thought I was a puppet whose strings he could cut. He didn't realize I had already woven those strings into a ladder. The next day, the news hit the front pages. Logistics giant arrested for multi-million-dollar fraud and conspiracy. The image of David in handcuffs, his power suit wrinkled and his face hidden, was everywhere. I didn't watch the news. I was too busy. I spent the morning in the break room with the warehouse staff, listening to their ideas for better safety protocols. I spent the afternoon at a local college, setting up a scholarship fund for women looking to re-enter the workforce after a hiatus. I stayed quiet, and that scared them more. But now, my silence wasn't a cage. It was a choice. I kept the house, but I stripped the floral wallpaper. I sold the expensive, cold furniture and replaced it with things that felt like me. I kept the blue dress, though. I hung it in the very back of the closet, a reminder of the woman I used to be and the woman I will never be again. David is currently serving a 10-year sentence. He calls sometimes, trying to apologize, trying to manipulate, trying to ask for one last favor. I never pick up. I don't need to hear his voice to know I've won. The greatest revenge isn't just taking someone's company or their money. It's living a life so full and so honest that they become nothing more than a footnote in your story. I was the penniless housewife who bought his company. But more importantly, I'm the woman who finally bought back her soul. Hey, thank you so much for following this journey with me. This story is a reminder that you are never as invisible as people make you feel. If you found this ending satisfying, please subscribe and hit that like button. It means the world to me. I have a question for you tonight. If you had the chance to completely reinvent yourself tomorrow, what's the one thing you'd change first? Let's talk about it in the comments. If you liked this story, you'll love my other videos.